If guilt could be bottled, mine would have poisoned the entire forest by now. I wasn't supposed to feel this way, not about him. Not here, not under the sterile lights of a government research station wrapped in pine and silence. Yet every time his eyes flicked toward me, it was like a match striking inside my chest. By 2040, America had long turned its forests into guarded reserves, half for preservation, half for surveillance. I was appointed lead professor in a remote biology outpost in Oregon, studying genetic resilience in plant life. At least, that was the official reason. Unofficially, I was escaping a failed marriage, a career tarnished by whispers, and a secret I never allowed myself to touch, until he walked into my lab. His name was Evan, 20 years old, stubborn, brilliant in bursts, and maddening in every other way. He wasn't assigned to me by accident. I knew the administration's hand was at work. Still, when he first stormed into my office with his hair damp from rain and his boots dragging mud across the sterilized floor, I had no idea he was carrying more than a student's reckless arrogance. I had no idea he was carrying my blood. "Professor Hale," he said that day, refusing to meet my gaze as if I were just another obstacle. "I've been told you're my mentor. Don't expect me to call you sir." I should have reprimanded him. Instead, I laughed a dry, bitter sound that startled even me. "Then don't expect me to tolerate mediocrity," I replied. The truth? He reminded me of myself at that age. Too sharp, too restless, too unwilling to belong. And beneath the irritation, something magnetic pulsed, something I fought to bury beneath professionalism and guilt. Weeks bled into months. Research was demanding, but it was the long nights with Evan that undid me. He'd sit cross-legged on the floor of the greenhouse, data pads scattered around him, while I pretended to read through reports. Sometimes he'd ask about mutations in the pine DNA strands we sequenced, other times about the world outside the Forster world that had already broken me. "You act like the city chewed you up and spat you out," he said once, leaning back on his elbows, looking at me through half-lidded eyes. What was it? Politics? Love? Both? I admitted before I could stop myself. The silence that followed was heavier than any confession I'd ever made. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. The late-night arguments that slipped into laughter, the brush of his arm against mine when he leaned over a microscope, the accidental intimacy of shared cigarettes under the research dome when the lights went out. And in the stillness of those nights, when the forest outside hummed like it was listening, I found myself craving something I could never claim. Because while Evan didn't know, I did. I knew the secret file locked in my desk drawer. I knew the genetic test that had crossed my desk 6 months ago, a report from the very department that had assigned him to me. Evan wasn't just my student. He was my son. Yet when he looked at me with something raw in his eyes, something more than admiration, I burned with the cruelest of desires. Not paternal, not innocent, but human, flawed, and dangerously close to breaking both of us. The forest became our accomplice. Pines whispered in the wind, rivers carried our secrets downstream, and even the lab itself seemed to thrum with the electricity between us. But every step closer to him felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I wanted to protect him from the truth, from myself, from the cruel symmetry of our connection. One night the storm hit. Rain lashed against the greenhouse walls, thunder splitting the sky. We were trapped inside, both of us drenched from running between labs. Evan sat shivering by the heater, his shirt clinging to his chest. I told myself not to look. I told myself to focus on the research files glowing faintly in the corner. But he caught me staring. "Why do you look at me like that?" he asked softly. I froze. "Like what?" "Like you're afraid of me." His voice cracked. "Or maybe afraid of yourself." I should have lied, should have laughed it off. Instead, I whispered, "Both." And then he kissed me. It was clumsy, desperate, like he'd been holding it in for weeks. I wanted to push him away, to scream that this was wrong, but my body betrayed me. My hands gripped his shoulders, my mouth answering his hunger with my own. For one impossible moment, the world outside ceased to exist. It was just rain, breath, and the devastating truth I carried. When I finally pulled back, he searched my face like it held all the answers he'd been starving for. "What are you hiding from me?" he demanded. The words cut deeper than the kiss. Because how could I tell him? How could I shatter the fragile, beautiful disaster we'd just created? I lied, of course. I told him he was too young, that I was his professor, that nothing could happen. He looked at me with betrayal burning in his eyes. And for the first time, I realized I was no longer running from my past. I was standing in the middle of it, and it was about to consume us both. The storm outside hadn't eased by morning, but Evan didn't show up for his shift in the greenhouse. His absence spread through the research station like an unspoken accusation. I buried myself in lab notes, eyes fixed on DNA sequences I could no longer process, while a voice in my head kept repeating what I'd let happen. When he finally appeared in the doorway hours later, his hair dry and his clothes crisp, it was as if the night before had been swallowed whole by the forest. He didn't speak, just set a stack of samples on the counter and moved past me, his shoulders rigid, his silence heavier than any confrontation. I almost told him then, almost ripped open the secret file and shoved the truth into the space between us. But fear cowardly, selfish fear clamped down on my throat, because telling him would mean losing him forever, and I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I forced normalcy. Lectures about protein chains, corrections on his notes, small arguments about his lack of discipline. But beneath every word, I heard the echo of that kiss, felt the pull of something I couldn't unfeel. Days blurred. Nights became unbearable. Evan withdrew, but not completely. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable. Other times, he'd bait me into arguments just to close the space between us, his body leaning in, his breath hot with defiance. Then came the field mission. We were tasked with collecting samples from a newly cordoned sector of the forest, a place rumored to have mutated flora resistant to drought. The government wanted results fast. I didn't want Evan to come, but protocol demanded a student accompany me. So there we were, hiking through the dense canopy, the hum of drones overhead and the silence of our unsaid words between us. At midday he stopped, dropping his pack. "Why are you doing this to me?" I pretended not to understand. Doing what? Pulling me in, then pushing me away, treating me like a kid one second and something else the next. "You think I don't notice?" His voice cracked, the forest swallowing it whole. "Evan," I started, but the name burned in my mouth. "You kissed me back," he said, eyes fierce. "Don't stand there and tell me it didn't mean anything." The truth clawed at my throat. I wanted to scream it, to confess everything, but instead I said, "It can't happen again." "Why?" His fists clenched at his sides. "Because you're scared? Because you're my professor? Or because you actually feel something and you don't know what to do with it?" I turned away, heart pounding, lungs aching. The words I didn't say were a knife twisting deeper. "Because I'm your father." We worked in silence after that, tension thick enough to suffocate. By dusk, as we returned to camp, Evan walked ahead of me, shoulders stiff, head high. I thought the distance was permanent. Until the accident. One of the drones malfunctioned, clipping a tree branch and crashing near the ridge. The impact set off a cascade of falling limbs. I heard the crack before I saw a massive branch snapping loose, plunging toward Evan. Instinct took over. I shoved him aside, the weight slamming across my shoulder and pinning me to the ground. Pain ripped through me. His hands were on me in seconds, frantic, shaking, trying to lift the branch. "Don't you dare!" he shouted, voice raw. "Don't you dare leave me like this." Somehow, adrenaline gave him strength. The branch shifted, enough for him to drag me free. My arms screamed in protest, but all I could focus on was the way his tears streaked down his dirt-smudged face. "Why?" he whispered, gripping my shirt. "Why would you risk yourself like that?" I wanted to say the truth, that he was my son, that no instinct was stronger than protecting him. But instead, I let the lie slip again. "Because I couldn't lose you." And then his mouth was on mine, desperate and furious, tasting of blood and rain. I didn't push him away. God help me, I couldn't. The following weeks spiraled into something dangerous. We stopped pretending. In the isolation of the research station, boundaries blurred. Nights ended with whispered arguments that dissolved into embraces neither of us could resist. Days were marked by stolen glances, hands brushing in the lab, tension burning hotter than the sterile lights above us. I hated myself. Every touch was a betrayal, not of the rules, not of my title, but of him. Because every time his lips touched mine, I knew I was stealing from him the truth he deserved. Then, one evening, I returned to my quarters to find the file drawer open. The genetic report, the one I'd kept locked away, was gone. My chest collapsed. I found him in the greenhouse, sitting on the floor with the report in his lap, his face ghost pale. He didn't look up when I entered. How long? His voice was flat, lifeless. Evan, how long have you known? The silence between us screamed louder than any confession. He lifted his eyes, red and wet but burning with fury. You knew. All this time you knew. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't find words big enough to explain the impossible. I wanted to protect you, I managed. Protect me? His laugh was hollow, broken. From what? From the truth? Or from you? He stood, shoving past me, the report crumpling in his fist. You don't get to call what we had protection. You don't get to call it anything. I reached for him, but he recoiled like my touch was poison. I don't ever want to see you again. And then he was gone, the greenhouse door slamming shut, leaving me alone with the shattered pieces of the life I tried so desperately to control. That night, the forest didn't whisper. It screamed. The wind tore through the pines, rattling the windows, as if the earth itself was condemning me. I sat alone in my quarters, staring at the report Evan had left behind, my name printed beside his DNA like a scar across the page. For the first time in years, I cried. Not for me, not even for what we'd lost, but for the boy who never asked to be my son, never asked to carry the burden of my silence, and never should have had to suffer the weight of my desire. But as dawn crept through the trees, a thought struck me like lightning. The forest was bigger than my mistakes. And if I wanted to salvage even a fragment of redemption, I'd have to fight for him, not as a lover, not as a professor, but as the father I should have been from the start. The station felt like a mausoleum after Evan left. His absence pressed into every corner, the empty chair at the lab bench, the silence where his laughter once echoed, the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the dormitory corridor. I told myself I could endure it. I told myself this was better than seeing the loathing in his eyes every time he looked at me. But the truth? Every second without him hollowed me out like rot beneath bark. He left no note, no goodbye, just a requisition form stamped for reassignment, signed off by the central administration in Portland. I had the paper in my hand before sunrise, reading and rereading his request to transfer, my own signature required to authorize it. My hand shook over the pen. Prove it and I lose him forever. Deny it, and I chain him to a place he despises and to me, the man he cannot forgive. I signed it. By dusk, the transport drone had come to collect him. I didn't go to the launch pad. Couldn't. I stood in the greenhouse instead, staring at the bioluminescent vines we'd nurtured together. Each glowing leaf a reminder of the nights we'd spent talking until dawn. I pressed my palm against the glass as the drone lifted into the sky, a small dark shadow vanishing between the trees. And with it, the only chance I'd ever had to be something other than a coward. Weeks passed. The station resumed its routine, genetic sampling, crossbreeding trials, government reports filed with the precision of a machine. My colleagues assumed my grimness was exhaustion. They didn't know it was grief. At night, I walked the forest trails alone, the pines swaying like judges over my sins. But the forest, as always, had its way of punishing those who ignored it. It began with whispers of contamination. Reports trickled in from other stations. Mutated flora spreading faster than projected, drought-resistant strains consuming entire valleys, their roots strangling native growth. At first, I dismissed it as exaggeration. Then the evidence arrived in our own sector plants we'd engineered behaving like predators, their vines tightening around equipment, sap burning through metal casings. I buried myself in the crisis, desperate for distraction. But late one night, combing through corrupted genetic files, I found Evan's data signature embedded in the strands. He'd been the one who discovered the mutations first, weeks before the outbreak. His notes, hastily written but brilliant, warned of instability in the Pine genome, a flaw we'd overlooked. He'd tried to sound the alarm, and I'd been too consumed by our secret to notice. The shame crushed me. I had failed him not just as a father, not just as a professor, but as a scientist. I had to find him. Portland in 2040 was a city of neon scars, gleaming biotech towers stitched into a landscape still aching from decades of climate collapse. I hadn't set foot there in years, not since I'd chosen exile in the forest. The air smelled of smog and wet concrete. Drones buzzed overhead like flies, scanning for contraband, while billboards flashed advertisements for genetic upgrades like candy. It didn't take long to find Evan. His name appeared in the database of the Institute of Applied Genetics, a lower-tier branch facility near the riverfront. He was listed as a junior researcher, assisting with drought-resilient crops. I shouldn't have gone. I had no right, but every step toward that building felt inevitable, like gravity pulling me toward the wreckage of my choices. Through the glass atrium, I saw him. He hadn't changed much, still defiant, still restless, but there was a hardness now in the set of his jaw, a guardedness in his eyes. He moved among the researchers with confidence, his hands steady as he calibrated equipment. Watching him was like being pierced by sunlight and fire all at once. I almost walked away, almost let him live the life he deserved without my shadow staining it. But then he looked up. Our eyes met. The glass between us may as well have been air. His expression flickered from shock to rage to something unnameable. Then he turned his back on me. It should have ended there. But fate is crueler than any man. That night, the city alarms shrieked. Sirens wailed across Portland as emergency broadcasts cut into every channel. The mutated flora had breached containment zones. Entire neighborhoods near the riverfront were under quarantine. Reports spoke of vines erupting from sewer systems, wrapping around buildings, suffocating anything in reach. And at the center of the outbreak, the Institute of Applied Genetics. I ran through flooded streets, past barricades, ignoring soldiers shouting for me to turn back. The closer I got, the worse it became. Glass shattered, roots cracking asphalt, the air heavy with spores that shimmered like dust in the floodlights. The institute loomed like a dying beast, its walls fractured by invasive growth. Inside, chaos reigned. Researchers scrambled through smoke and vines, their white coats smeared with sap. And amid the disaster, I found Evan, a mask strapped to his face, wielding a blade to hack through the encroaching plants as he guided people toward the exits. For a heartbeat, pride eclipsed everything. He was braver than I'd ever been. Then the ceiling groaned. A mass of vines broke loose, crashing down toward him. Instinct surged through me, the same as in the forest weeks ago. I lunged, shoving him clear as the weight slammed me into the floor. Pain exploded in my chest, sap burning my skin where it touched. Damn it! Evan's voice cracked through the chaos as he tore at the vines pinning me. Not again. You're not dying on Menet like this. His hands were frantic, desperate, pulling until the vines snapped loose. He dragged me out, coughing, our bodies collapsing against the broken floor. For the first time in weeks, our eyes locked without pretense. No anger, no lies, just two men on the edge of ruin. You should have let me die, I rasped. Shut up. His hands shook as they pressed against my wound. I don't care who you are to Mayo, don't get to leave me twice. The words gutted me. In the smoke and fire, with the city crumbling around us, the truth no longer mattered the way it once had. I wasn't his lover, and I wasn't the father he deserved. But I was here, and I wasn't letting go. Together, we stumbled through the ruins, side by side, until the night swallowed us whole. The fires burned for 3 days before Portland could breathe again. Soldiers in biohazard suits marched through streets blanketed in ash. Drones sprayed suppressant foam over charred vines, and the river itself ran black with sap. Survivors huddled in stadiums converted into triage centers. Scientists from across the country descended on the city, hungry for answers. Through it all, Evan barely spoke to me. He worked alongside the rescue teams, his movements sharp and purposeful, his jaw set like iron. I shadowed him when I could, patching wounds, running analyses, lending whatever authority remained in my title. But every time our eyes met, he turned away. The gulf between us was wide, yet in the wreckage, I began to hope it wasn't permanent. One night, when the worst had passed, we found ourselves alone on the riverbank. The city glowed faintly in the distance, a skeleton stitched together by floodlights. The water lapped quietly, carrying with it the stench of chemicals and ash. "You should have stayed in the forest," Evan said finally, his voice tired, almost resigned. "I couldn't," I admitted. "Not when I knew you were here. Not when I knew I'd already failed you once." His laugh was hollow. "Failed me? That's one way to put it." I sat beside him, leaving space between us. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even deserve to ask for it. But Evan, everything I've done, every mistake, every cowardly silence wasn't because I didn't care. It was because I cared too damn much." He didn't look at me. "You lied to me. You let me fall into something I never should have felt. Do you know what that did to me?" The words cut deeper than any wound the vines had left. "I know," I whispered, "and I'll live with it for the rest of my life. But I swear to you, no matter what, I'll never abandon you again. Not as your professor. Not as," my voice faltered, "not as your father." The word hung heavy between us. For a long moment, there was only the river, only the broken city. Then he exhaled, a sound that was neither anger nor forgiveness but something rawer, something in between. "I don't know if I can ever see you that way," he said. His eyes glistened in the half-light. "But I can't keep hating you either. Not after this." It wasn't absolution, but it was a beginning. Weeks turned to months. Portland rebuilt slowly, the scars of the outbreak etched into its skyline. Evan remained with the Institute, rising quickly through its ranks, his brilliance undeniable. I returned to the forest station, this time not as an exile but as a man determined to rebuild the science I had once let rot. We kept in touch first through stiff, formal reports, then through calls that grew longer with each passing week. Our conversations were cautious at first, orbiting around research and data, never touching the wound that bound us. But slowly, carefully, we began to stitch something new. One spring afternoon, he arrived at the station unannounced. The pines were in bloom, their needles shimmering under a soft rain. He stood in the doorway of my lab, older somehow, though only months had passed. "Still fighting with plants?" he asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Still saving the world?" I countered. We laughed, awkward but real. He stepped closer, looking around the greenhouse we had once shared. "It feels different now." "Because it is?" I said softly. He met my gaze, and this time he didn't look away. "I don't know what we're supposed to be. I don't even know if I want to know yet. But maybe we can figure it out. Together." Hope flickered in my chest for the first time in years. "I'd like that," I said. We stood among the glowing vines, the forest humming quietly around us. Not as forbidden lovers, not as enemies, but as something fragile and new, something that might one day grow into what we both needed. A bond built not on secrets, but on truth. Years later, historians would write about the outbreak of 2040, about how America nearly lost an entire city to the arrogance of science. They would write about Evan Hale, the young researcher who helped contain the disaster and went on to pioneer ethical genetics. Some would mention me, Professor Gabriel Haley, in passing, as the mentor who guided him, the man who helped build the safeguards that would keep humanity safe. But the real story wasn't in the books. It was in the quiet evenings when Evan visited the station, when we walked the forest trails together, speaking of everything and nothing. It was in the tentative laughter that replaced silence, in the understanding that forgiveness wasn't a single moment but a choice made again and again. And in that choice I finally found peace. Not the peace of a man unburdened me sins would never leave me, but the peace of a man who, at last, dared to stay. The pines swayed overhead, their needles whispering in the wind. For the first time in a long time, I listened. And this time, the forest wasn't condemning me. It was forgiving me. Thank you for listening. Like and subscribe to get notifications about next videos.